I shall get started with the introduction to the journal. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Innovation in Linguistic talk series of Cognitive Semantics. We're delighted to have you join us for the 21st talk. And I am Zivan Li from Beihang University as one of the editorial assistants of the journal. And first, please allow me a brief introduction to the organizer of tonight's talk, the journal Cognitive Semantics. This is a peer-reviewed international journal published by Beihang. The central concern is a relationship between meaning and mind. It welcomes unpublished research from all theoretical orientations in linguistics and is also a forum for scholars who are interested in related fields such as psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence to discuss their work on the many and varied aspects of human cognition. Cognitive semantics is also indexed by Scopus and Web of Science, and we are also thrilled to announce a significant development thanks to the generous sponsorship from Beihang University. Cognitive semantics has now transitioned to an open access model. In other words, all of our cutting-edge research published in this journal is now freely available to the global academic community. And for more information, please feel free to scan the QR code here. The journal is managed by Fuyin Thomas Lee from Beihang University as the founding editor and editor-in-chief. The consulting editors include George Lakoff, Rona Lanaker, and Elena Telmi. We extend our sincere gratitude to all the editors and editorial assistants, including Ze Ronggao Yuhang Yang from Beihang University and Na Liu from Central China Normal University. And tonight, we are very honored and excited to have Professor Hans-Jörg Schmid to join us. And he come from the LMU Munich in Germany. He is a full professor and chair of modern English linguistics at LMU Munich. Furthermore, he has been appointed editor-in-chief of the flagship journal Cognitive Linguistics since January 2025. Professor Schmid's research interests primarily focus on cognitive linguistics, lexical semantics, syntax, word formation, pragmatics, and language change. He has made significant contributions to our field and has authored several key monographs, including an introduction to cognitive linguistics, which is a must read for all of us, and English morphology, and word formation, and more recently, the dynamics of linguistic system, usage, conventionalization, and entrenchment, as well as entrenchment and conventionalization towards a unified usage-based socio-cognitive model of language structure, variation, and change. In today's lecture, Professor Schmid will share insights from his enlightening research, focusing on the entrenchment and conventionalization model. The title of his talk is, What is Meaning? Where can we find it? And how does it change? The perspective of the entrenchment and conventionalization model. And now, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Hans-Jörg Schmid. Professor, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, first of all, Thomas and Sifan. It's a great honor to speak here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. Let me first, before I start, apologize once more. This meeting was supposed to take place 3 weeks ago, and I was stupid enough to get the time conversion wrong. So would like to apologize to everybody who was here 3 weeks ago, and especially to the two of you, because you had to keep people patient for such a long time. I'm very sorry about that, and I hope I can make up for that today by giving at least a decent talk. Right, then I'll try to share my screen so we can follow the presentation. Okay, does this work all right? Can you see it?
Yes, we can now see the slide.
Okay, very good. Then, yes, as you said, the title is What is Meaning? Where can we find it and how does it change? The perspective of the entrenchment and conventionalization model. When I was invited to give this talk, I thought, well, it's the Journal of Cognitive Semantics, so it would be a good occasion to go back to something I studied a long time ago, lexical semantics and semantics in general. And the series title, Innovation in Linguistics, suggested a talk that maybe does not focus on one particular phenomenon, but gives a wider conceptual program for the study of meaning. And since the model I've been working on for the past years, the entrenchment and conventionalization model, lends itself to such a study. This is what I'm now planning to talk about. More specifically, I will start by giving a brief history of milestones in the study of meaning, some classics, and then this will, lead to the conclusion that meaning is multifaceted and there are different sources feeding into it. Next, I will introduce the key components of the so-called EC model and talk about what is meaning according to the model and where is it located. And I will close with a longer portion about what is gained by using this approach, and I will focus on four issues, topics, questions where I think that we might make some progress. The integration of classic insights like prototype theory, basic level effects, effects of chunking, then the traditional problem of demarcating semantics from pragmatics, a quite specific but important problem in construction grammar, which is the fat node problem. And I will finish off with some remarks on semantic change, which is also part of the title of the lecture, of course. Right, then let's go into the milestones of the study of meaning, beginning with Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist that all of you, I think, have heard about, famous as the person who introduced structuralist thought into linguistics at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. What is meaning according to Saussure? On the one hand, it is a symbolic association between the two sides of the sign, the image acoustique or sound image, and the concept or concept. And yet, this is not really the locus of meaning according to Saussure, because he says the value, the significance of the sign, actually on both sides, with regard to meaning and form, lies in the difference to other signs as emerging from social interaction. And that's one core idea of the structuralist approach. So paradigmatic differences, paradigmatic relations are very prominent in Saussure's approach to meaning. And he also has a chapter or two on syntagmatic associations, which also play a role to give a sign its value in the system that is language. So we can summarize by saying for Saussure, meaning is mainly paradigmatic, a little bit syntagmatic, but the system that gives the meaning emerges from the social environment, and within the sign, we also have a symbolic relation, and we can represent this to visualize it in the following way. There's a symbolic relation between the sound image tree and the image of a tree. Then there is the key aspect of having a paradigmatic relation to competing to words with competing meanings. We have a syntagmatic relation to words that tend to go with tree, like plant, cut, prune, or climb a tree. And then we have the social environment that serves as the background, as the resource from which the interaction of paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations emerges. What is the locus of meaning? Where is meaning according to Saussure? It's a bit ambiguous. The symbolic associations are in the minds of speakers. We can be quite clear about that. The differential value of the sign is in some sort of abstract system. And as I said, the system is more important than the individual sign. So that we can summarize by saying the symbolic association is in the mind. The paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations are give a given item the place in the system, derived from social interaction. And it is only in this sense that usage also plays a role. It is a source of meaning, but it is not the place where Saussure would look for meaning. Next, we can have a look at J.R. Firth and British contextualism at large, using the example of John Sinclair. And J.R. Firth is, of course, famous for having coined or introduced the term collocation. For him, meaning is a function of elements in their linguistic, textual, situational, and social context, so that his focus is on syntagmatic relations, but also on pragmatic and social aspects of meaning. And John Sinclair is well known for his idea that the word is not always the carrier of meaning. Instead, larger units are, and this is related to his idiom principle. Excuse me for a second. So, compared to Saussure, we have a shift of focus to syntagmatic aspects and an added focus on the linguistic and wider situational and social context. And if we draw the same kind of paragram visualization, we can see that the symbolic association is practically non-existent, whereas the focus goes into syntagmatic. Here is my pointer. I hope this works. Syntagmatic associations assisted, supported by pragmatic and social relations in the system. As far as the locus of meaning is concerned, according to Firth, we can say that it's neither in the mind nor in some sort of abstract system, but it lies in the interaction of elements as used in linguistic, situational, and social context. And this is the shift to syntagmatic aspects, as I said before. Meaning is in usage. It's not in the mind, it's not in the community. It derives from the community, of course, but for him, usage is the key factor, and Sinclair goes along with parts of that, at least. A third aspect, or a third person and approach I want to introduce is the so-called meaning is use approach, associated, among others, with Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher of language, who said that meaning more or less equals use, and it emerges from language games, the social activity, or repeated types of social activities using language. I would like to mention another Swiss linguist called Ernst Leisy, who also went down that path by saying the meaning of a word is equal to the conventional conditions for how to use it. And this brings in a focus on pragmatic and social aspects of language use. So what is meaning? Overall, the picture looks similar to what we saw before, but the syntagmatic aspect is clearly less prominent. The pragmatic and the social aspects are very important for this conception of meaning. And this idea is very clear about where meaning is found, so to speak. It's neither in the mind nor in the system. It's located in repeated social situations. So not mind, but some sort of interaction between usage and community. And then, well, it's a talk organized by cognitive semantics, so we need the cognitive semantic view associated with big names like Eleanor Roche, Charles Fillmore, George Lakoff, and Ron Laneke. What is meaning according to the cognitive enterprise? Meaning is conceptualization derived from linguistic and embodied experience. Not everyone subscribes to all components of this definition, but meaning is conceptualization, I think, is widely agreed upon as the idea of meaning. It is available in the form of concepts, prototype representations, frames, idealized cognitive and cultural models, and depending on the approach, there's a stronger focus on concepts, so small-scale cognitive units or larger knowledge structures such as conceptual networks or frames. The focus is clearly on symbolic conceptual representations, which can be represented by saying it's mainly symbolic and connected in the mind. There's clearly some paradigmatic and syntagmatic aspect to it, and I'm sure there's lots of people in the audience here who would argue that pragmatics and social aspects also play a role, but it doesn't lie at the heart. We can quarrel about that in the question and answer session, perhaps, if you like. As far as where meaning is located, it's very clear that is a cognitive phenomenon. It's symbolic associations between forms and meanings. Usage in the community serves as the basis for the emerging meanings, but without the mind, there is no meaning. Let me summarize this part very briefly. Beginning with what is meaning, the options that we've seen boil down to the following. It can be symbolic in nature, a link between linguistic forms and conceptual representations. It can be more paradigmatic in nature, so contrasts, or of course also similarity relations, synonymy and the like between competing signs. Syntagmatic combinations in linear sequence have been recruited as a source for meaning, pragmatic conditions for how to use a word, and finally, social aspects, social framing for how a word is used. And on the right, you see a fairly neutral representation of what you saw before. All those lines have the same, they're equally thick or bold. So that's the general options that we have as semiotic resources, as I will call them later. Where is meaning? The options are in a system shared by the members of a community, in the minds of speakers, and or in social situations of language use. So let's keep that in mind for a few moments, and let me introduce some key components of the entrenchment and conventionalization model, or EC model, beginning with the ultimate source of meaning and all the rest that is part of the model and of meaning. It's something that I call co-semiosis in rich usage events. And I would like to start by a definition of the notion of usage event taken from Ron Laneke. Let me just briefly read it out. It's a quotation. Also, units emerge from usage events, instances of language use in the full detail of their contextual apprehension by the reinforcement of recurring commonalities. That's a key insight, I think. One recurring feature is the very fact that the speaker and hearer are interacting by using the language in question. Hence, the ground, the interlocutors, their interaction, and its circumstances figures at least peripherally in the import of every unit. Indeed, abstracted units can incorporate any facet of the speech situation common to the usage events giving rise to them, such as the following: age, gender, and status of the interlocutors, their social relationship, nature of the occasion, degree of formality, attitudinal, emotive, and affective factors, and of course the language or conceived linguistic variety employed. So the units that are at the heart of Lanneker's notion of cognitive grammar emerge from usage events, and the units can be very rich in information because every single commonality that is extracted from similar usage events can find its way into the unit. Let's take this very serious and illustrate it very briefly with another graph here. This is two speakers, or a speaker on the left, a hearer on the other. The speaker uses an utterance form which is then apprehended and comprehended ideally by the hearer. The speaker comes along with communicative goals. He wants to get something done. He has a speaker in mind. There are emotions involved in what he's doing, and he brings along social characteristics, demographic, but also relational characteristics. Does he know the person he's addressing, and so on? On the hearer side, we have the same. The hearer has communicative goals. She tries to construct a meaning. She brings along expectations regarding a meaning. She brings along emotions and also social characteristics, as mentioned by Lanneker in the quotation I read out. All this takes place in a situational context, in a setting involving time and place and things around objects you can point to. The situational context also involves social relations, and it involves something we can call activity type. So we are aware of the kind of situation that's going on currently. Here I'm giving an online lecture. Other activity types would be a service encounter, a casual conversation on a bus or in a pub or restaurant, and so on. The sociocultural context also lies behind or is involved in the understanding and the mutual understanding of the utterance form. And this involves the type of community in which the encounter is embedded, the usage event, the social order of this community. Is it very hierarchical or rather flat? What are its social norms and values? All this, not just the message and the situation, but all the rest, and in fact more, feeds into the meaning construction that goes on in every single usage event that takes place, be it in direct conversation, be it when you read something written on an online website, when you read a book written by someone 200 or 2000 years ago. It's always the same process, and the name for the process is co-semiosis. It's a bit of an unusual term because I want to highlight a number of things. In fact, highlights the fact that meaning making is worked out together, not just by one person. Semiosis is a way of strengthening the fact that it's not just arriving at a meaning, but it is a constant process of meaning negotiating. And the goal of co-semiosis is something I call the mutual belief of mutual understanding. I'm sure everybody has been in a situation where you understand what the other person says, or where you as a speaker have the feeling that the other person has understood you, but you're not 100% sure whether they've also understood the implications, what you are trying to get done in an indirect speech act, for example. So perfect, that's an idealization, perfect understanding, a perfect co-construction of meaning has this double mutuality. Both of the people involved, especially in synchronic conversation taking place at a time and in one place. In this case, we expect or we want the mutual belief of mutual understanding, a double reflexivity. Okay, Now, it's important to understand all this because whenever we talk about meaning, this is the place where meaning starts out, from which it can emerge. And it's also, the usage event is also the place that brings about the rich material that can go into meanings of words and larger expressions. The way this happens is described in the entrenchment and conventionalization model as a double feedback loop system. Maybe some of you have seen these graphs. I apologize that they're repeated here. We have a system where that connects usage in the center, community and society on the left, and the cognition of the minds of individual speakers on the right. And the point of this picture is that repeated usage events, symbolized by these unruly lines in the middle, have two effects. On the one hand, they receive the regularity from conventions that have been established in a community of speakers in a society, and they in turn reinforce these conventions, and at the same time they must be informed by entrenched knowledge about the language, which is then again also reinforced by the repetition that takes place in usage events. And the way I usually represent this is by this little machine here. As soon as there are repeated usage events, what we get is that conventions are recruited for mutual understanding and in turn receive confirmation by mutual understanding, and entrenched patterns of associations are brought to the usage events because they inform what needs to be said in order to get mutual understanding underway. And this in turn is also then refreshed by every single usage event that a given speaker participates in. According to the usage-based commitment, very strong in cognitive linguistics in general and cognitive semantics, the underlying logic of this is that the more frequently a given convention is used, the more conventionalized it becomes. The more conventionalized it has become by past usage, the more efficient it is for mutual understanding, because conventions, of course, are something we can rely upon for creating mutual understanding. At the same time, the more frequently a given speaker has activated associations that are responsible for either producing or comprehending any word or given pattern or construction, the more frequently this has happened, the more strongly the corresponding parts of the associative network that hosts linguistic knowledge are entrenched. And the more entrenched, the more easily they will become activated. That's the very essence of entrenchment, according to Lanneker and Bybee originally. What is more easily activated than something else that could do the same job will also be chosen more frequently in the future, so that this entrenchment feedback cycle also comes full circle. And the two interact via usage. Entrenchment can only feed into the community if the speaker who has an entrenched representation of some linguistic element or pattern uses it in a concrete usage event, and this in turn can only feed into conventionalization, and the other way around. What is conventional can only stay conventional, be reinforced if we have speakers who carry, so to speak, this knowledge that lies behind the convention. That's just the general picture of it, and I will now briefly talk about the conventionalization feedback cycle and the entrenchment feedback cycle. I have talked about usage, and then see what this means for meaning. Okay, what are conventions? I define them as mutually known regularities of behavior which the members of a community conform to because they mutually expect each other to conform to them. And this is based on a large number of very, inspiring sources by, for example, Lewis, Schiffer, Clark, Croft, and also Rudi Keller. Conventions are flexible regularities of behavior, which can then be, sort of hypostatized, considered as entities that are utterance types or constructions or words, and these are condensed records of how they've been used in the past. Now, what are the processes that bring about conventionalization? I distinguish between two types. The first is usualization. It is the process that establishes and sustains a regularity of linguistic behavior. For example, the agreement that if you use the form table, you have the meaning table in mind. That is a regularity of linguistic behavior, a very simple one, or the regularity that the word dog often goes together with the word bark, for example, or wagging tail and stuff like this. Usualization is the process that establishes these regularities. And the question it answers, so to speak, is to what extent do the members of a group adhere to a convention, regardless of the size of the group. You can have a very small community of, say, a couple who know each other really well, have been together for a long time. They have their own little conventions. It can also be the community at large. And this brings us to diffusion, which is a spread of regularities of linguistic behavior across speakers, across groups, across communities, and across contexts. And this answers the question how many speakers or groups follow a convention and in what kinds of situations, regardless of the extent to which they do. So you can have conventions that are highly usualized, but only in a small community. You can also have conventions that are widely diffused, so everybody partakes in these conventions, but they are not highly usualized because not every or very few people might actually see something as a good solution for a communicative task. Right, now what are these regularities of behavior? They are of different types and they're all familiar to you. It's just that they are now find a place in a more systematic way of describing them. We have syntagmatic regularities like combining words. That is regularly combined with adjectives like right or good or fine or true and many more. That's a syntagmatic regularity. You wouldn't expect to see the word eat or drink following that because this would violate a syntagmatic regularity. Next, we have symbolic regularities of two types. You're familiar with those as well. The one we can call a semasiological symbolic regularity. It's a regularity in meaning that starts out from a linguistic form and connects this form in regular usage to various meanings like the verb run, to the meanings fast pedestrian locomotion, to manage a business. The machine doesn't run means it doesn't function anymore. And I'm using two sources by Dylan Glynn and Stefan Gries here to talk about that. It will come back later. The counterpart to semasiological symbolic regularity is onomasiological symbolic regularity, a difficult word or expression for a simple phenomenon. It is the perspective of the speaker who wants to talk some situation where something or somebody moves or comes or goes. And if you have that in mind, you have a variety of linguistic forms that allow you to encode this meaning, like go, come, get, leave, walk, and so on. All of this is regular in a symbolic way because it connects forms and meanings, and it is regular in the direction from intention and meaning to expressed by form. The next type of regularity is something I call co-textual regularity, and has to do with genres, with registers, with all kinds of, discourse traditions, if you like. Let's take as an example the communicative goal to introduce a report or some sort of narrative. And depending on the type of genre, different linguistic forms are more or less likely to be used. If it's a personal narrative in a spontaneous conversation, you can introduce a story you want to tell by saying, you know what happened to me last night. If it is a personal narrative in fiction, it could be the same, but it could also be something like he was really unhappy. This hadn't worked the way he expected, and so on. If it's a research report, this sort of narrative part would maybe begin with our methodology was as follows. If it's a hot news report in a newspaper, it will probably start with mentioning of the place where something happened, and then something like yesterday, 3 women were assaulted, or whatever terrible event took place. Now, the point here is that depending on the genre of text, different forms are more or less likely, and that's a regularity. We will notice in a research report, if you start your report by saying, you know what happened to me last night, why do you notice it? Because it's a violation, a break of a regularity that you have learned and experienced for many years. A contextual regularity is a situational regularity related to aspects of context like time and place and interlocutors. So here I take the example of the communicative goal of greeting. If this takes place in the situation in the morning, the most conventional way, the most regular way perhaps, is to say good morning. If it's lunchtime or onwards, it's good afternoon. It's in the evening, it's good evening. In any time, you can use something like hello. So there's a more open regularity here. But again, these are all conventions, and they are conventional with respect to the dimension of context. And finally, we have a regularity in dialects and accents and varieties in general that has to do with communities, with social aspects involved in the use of language. This is just any old picture I've ripped from the internet that talks about the different ways of referring to bread roll in the British Isles here. No need to go into that. I think you're familiar with all these examples. Again, an intermediate summary. So what are conventions? Conventions are regularities of behavior, and they're of several types. 2 types of symbolic regularities. So language is regular with regard to form-meaning relations. It is regular with regard to syntagmatic arrangement, linear arrangement, with regard to use in particular types of text, so to speak, in particular types of situations. That's contextual regularity. And with regard to the use by certain communities, by speakers with specific constellations of socio-demographic factors. Moving on to the right-hand side of the double feedback loop and the process of entrenchment, what is it? My preferred definition is that it is the continual reorganization of linguistic knowledge in the minds of speakers. So it's clearly cognitive, whereas conventionalization is clearly collective and social. It is a routinization process driven by repeated usage activities in repeated usage events or similar usage events. And that's perhaps a bit specific, but I think it pays off. It operates over patterns of associations in the associative networks of individual speakers based, as Laneke said, on commonalities of similar usage events, on any commonality of similar usage events, along those lines I just walked you through. This is a more general definition, just to remind you of that than the classic definitions by Ron Lanneker and John Bybee that are frequently quoted in the literature. Just briefly, what are patterns of associations? An association, also borrowed that term from Lanneker, who describes it in a very, or defines in a very general way, as the ability of one kind of experience to evoke another. And we distinguish 4 types, which of course will then tie in with the types of regularity: symbolic associations linking forms and meanings and forms. They will turn out to be fairly slim, keep that in mind. Syntagmatic associations linking sequentially arranged forms and meanings, as in the sequence "that's true." Paradigmatic associations linking competing forms and meanings. So the contrast between lovely, great, nice, and gorgeous in the pattern "that's lovely" is of a paradigmatic nature. How do these associations become established? When you speak or when you listen, always you have different options. There's always competition, and it's that competition set that you have in mind when preparing an utterance in the course of production. As the case here, the competition, for example, between lovely, great, nice, and gorgeous, which you can record and thereby routinize as an entrenched paradigmatic association. And finally, a large chunk, socio-pragmatic associations that connect linguistic forms and meanings to situation and social context. So in a very cliche manner of speaking, the expression "that's lovely," if you hear it in isolation, you'll probably connect it more likely to a maybe elderly female speaker than to a young, rough-talking male speaker. Okay, how does entrenchment work? How does the entrenchment feedback cycle work? The goal, in a metaphorical manner of speaking, don't get that wrong. In a metaphorical manner of speaking, the goal is to improve the predictive capacity of the associative network required for dealing with linguistic forms, meanings, and functions in ongoing production and comprehension. Ongoing production and comprehension are extremely rapid. We don't have the time to think about things, so we must zoom in, home in on what things mean and how we want to get meaning across in next to no time. And this only works if we have a strong predictive power in our associative network. And how do we increase this power? We increase it by tracking usage, again, metaphorically speaking, as greedily as we can, detecting any regularity of any kind. And this takes us back to the conventional dimensions, of course, of regularity, semi-zoological, and so on, and strengthen corresponding associations that reflect these regularities. This is the core of the process of routinization, of frequency-driven routinization. Okay, that's the model. What is all the effort worth, so to speak? Let's next look at how meaning would be described along the lines of such a model, beginning by 2 terms that I want to introduce. Meaning relies on semiotic resources, and it comes along in the form of semantic profiles, which is perhaps a term that you can connect to existing work like behavioral profiles. I'm going to mention that in a minute. Now, what are the semiotic resources? Where can we recruit information that will allow us to engage in cosemiosis? That is the question. And we now know it. The semiotic resources are all the types of regularity that we can find in conventions: symbolic, syntagmatic, pragmatic, social, and paradigmatic regularities. I hope I'm consistent in the use of the regularities, as sometimes play around with those a little. And the different constellations of these semiotic resources, as shown before, can give any expression, word, construction, its semantic profile or its semantic profiles, depending, of course, on how it is used and how these semiotic resources are exploited in given usage events. I hope you get what this means. We can recruit any regularity to co-construct meaning in a given usage event, and different items can have different, that's the idea about semantic profiles, can have different prominence regarding which of those regularity dimensions and hence associations are particularly prominent. You can imagine words that are particularly informed with regard to their semantic profile as represented here by paradigmatic and symbolic associations. I'll illustrate that in a second, or symbolic and syntagmatic, or perhaps pragmatic and social. This will, as I said, be illustrated with some data in a second. Now, where is meaning according to this model? There's a complex relation between community, usage, and mind according to it in the following way. The community provides the various types of regularity as the semiotic resources, as I just explained. These regularities as semiotic resources are exploited for co-semiosis in usage event. If you come across a speaker who speaks in a totally irregular way, not sticking to conventions, co-semiosis is in trouble. It will be way more difficult to understand each other or come to this point where you think you understand each other because the regularity is missing. So the regularities, conventions, are the prerequisites for successful, or at least decently successful co-semiosis. This in turn, or the repeated effects of co-semiosis, become entrenched as patterns of associations. And that's the cognitive part of the meaning of creating process. It's what we have stored, so to speak. Which in turn then feeds into co-semiosis. We need to have it stored in order to understand. It is our linguistic knowledge. And the usage events can then, following the double feedback loop, in turn feedback into the regularities, maybe change them a little or refresh them exactly the way they've become conventionalized over a long time. Now, these examples. I've taken these examples. I've done some corpus studies, very simple corpus studies, to illustrate what I've been talking about in very theoretical terms so far. I've used the British National Corpus, and I've taken advantage of the wonderful tools provided by the platform Sketch Engine. You can follow this up following this link here. And in particular, I've used a tool that the Sketch Engine people call Word Sketch. And on the website, they define it as follows. The Word Sketch processes the word's collocates and other words in its surroundings. It can be used as a one-page summary of the word's grammatical and collocational behavior. The results are organized into categories called grammatical relations, such as words that serve as an object of the verb, words that serve as a subject of the verb, words that modify the word, etc. The words which will be included in the analysis are defined by rules written in the Sketch grammar that detects potential collocations. And these rules in this case here, in the Word Sketch case, are depend on a statistical measure of a co-occurrence called log dice. I've taken over this measure because it's used by Sketch Engine. It's not the worst you can choose, I think. And I've introduced a threshold for the following report of 8. So the log dice score, if the log dice score of a collocate is higher than 8, then I'm reporting it. If it's lower than 8, I'm not reporting it to keep things under control. The visualization I present is not the one offered by Sketch Engine. It's also a very good one, but since I introduced a clear threshold, I decided to represent the results in a different way. One remark before I show you the results, the exemplary results. All this information is strictly speaking syntagmatic, because Sketch Engine produces a summary of the co-occurrence and co-collocational behavior. But as you will see, and I hope agree with me, the syntagmatic information also provides information about the other dimensions of regularity. And if you start to think about it, all the large language models that we know, at least the ones that I know, derive their amazing grammatical competence simply from co-occurrence phenomena. So they're also syntagmatic, but apparently can behave systematically as regards meanings, even contexts, very good ones, even social regularities. Okay, so the syntagmatic dimension serves as the source, but it is interpreted in the way of other dimensions. Okay, let me begin by looking at two nouns that behave differently. The nouns tree and person, both of them are concrete nouns. So this is a representation. I hope you can see at least parts of it. I'll explain. It's a representation of the collocates that are statistically significantly attracted by the word tree. And the portions in the outer ring, they almost look the same, but this is because if you look at the part of the data that is larger than 8, according to the log dice, they are not, it's because of the logarithmic transformation, there's not such a difference anymore, but the portions are not equally sized, and they're arranged in terms of their size. Okay, now I've listed here the ones that you find here as modifiers of tree, palm tree, apple tree, oak tree, Christmas tree, pine tree, yew tree, beech tree, and fruit tree. They're all types of trees. And this is a kind of information that relates to the paradigmatic dimension because they are all subordinates of the concept of tree. They give semantic, they are a semiotic resource, so to speak, but and they occur in the syntagmatic environment, but what they bring along is basically paradigmatic information. Well, we can also add, looking at this word Christmas tree from Christian religion, that there is a social dimension that is also part of this list of collocates. On the left bottom side, this is complemented by cohyponyms occurring in and/or relations like tree and hedge, or tree and bush, or tree and shrub. That's again information about the paradigmatic dimension of meaning. Then we get a number of nouns combined in prepositional phrase combinations like clump of tree, shade of tree, trunk of tree, branch of tree, avenue of trees, and bark of tree. These are typical collocates, of course. They're semantically very specific. They're very strongly associated with the notion of tree. So this is the traditional syntagmatic information that we can derive from such studies. And we get more of those up here, bark and rot and shade. They also give information about the symbolic dimension. I'll say something about that in a second. They define attributes, and all this together produces some sort of frame idea revolving around the notion of tree. If we compare this to person, the first insight that we get is that person has a smaller number of collocates above the threshold. And if we look closer, we can see that they're also very, very different in nature. So the blue bit here and the orange bit is guilty person, responsible person, aggrieved person, liable, entitled, concerned, elderly, and so on. Very different from the types of trees we saw before. They are descriptive adjectives that define categories of social relevance. The guilty, liable, entitled, elderly, disabled. There's a strong social dimension in this. On the other hand, on the left side, we get collocations from the field of linguistics. We're all familiar with first also person pronoun, first person singular. So this is related. This has a strong contextual, topic-related component, and it also, of course, contributes to disambiguating the word person. It's a very different notion of person than in elderly person or disabled person. And we have a couple of more terms from the special field of, say, law, trespass, litigant, which is also strongly reliant on the contextual plus the social dimension. Now, if we compare the two, we can say tree, I mentioned that in passing only, of course, tree has a very or a strong symbolic foundation. If you hear the word, you can immediately imagine something. It has an intrinsic, strong inherent meaning. So there is a strong symbolic regularity and association with it. What we saw is that there's also strong paradigmatic relations, some specific syntagmatic, the pragmatic and the social aspect of meaning, or the pragmatic and social semiotic resource is not very strong for tree, but it does not, in a way, it doesn't need it because it is symbolically strong. In contrast, a person is not a very, rich concept. It basically means human being, and that's a fairly lean meaning in comparison. But it has a lot of, or it has specific as well as generic collocates that support the meaning. These are very strongly social in nature, in contrast to tree, and also pragmatic in nature, but there's not such a strong paradigmatic aspect to this. Semiotic resources we exploit for creating a meaning for the word person. Next, I want to look at two verbs that are very different. The very concrete verb smile, which like tree has an autonomous and rich meaning, and the fairly general light verb get. At first glance, you can see that get has a very large number of significant collocates. This may partly be due to the fact that get is, of course, way more frequent than smile. I'm not 100% sure about this. Smile has a much smaller number of collocates if we stick to this threshold. Now, smile is also interesting because it has all the ones that you see here on the left-hand side are what we can call descriptive collocates that are play a role on the syntagmatic dimension, but they don't introduce any semantic differentiation. They add nuances of smiling, but they don't really define the word smile semantically. Smile thinly, broadly, sweetly, and so on. You see the list in front of you, I hope. In contrast, get has a very rich array of various types of collocates. It relies very strongly on the syntagmatic dimension to compensate for the fact that the meaning, except in those few cases where it actually means obtain or receive, that the meaning is fairly slim and narrow and open. So here we have loads of collocates on the right-hand side that detail the meaning. So the syntagmatic dimension is very important for semantic differentiation. If you just go through a couple of them, get used is very different in meaning from get worse or get lost in turn. Get involved, get stuck, get better has to do with being ill. Get ready has to do with preparing for something. Get drunk is entirely different again. So the meaning of get is general, but it is becomes more concrete by virtue of the power of the syntagmatic dimension. And the same goes for what we see on the left-hand side here, where we get all those particles: get up, get off, get in, get out, get on, get down, then get back, get through. So we have lots of phrasal verbs, prepositional verbs here, verb uses, phrasal prepositional verb uses that are the real carriers of meaning, and they too, on the one hand, are syntagmatic in nature, but on the other hand, they're also paradigmatic, because you have get up and get out and get over and all those opposites in the arrangement of particles. So again, the comparison: smile relies very strongly on the symbolic semiotic resource and a little bit on the syntagmatic, whereas get relies on the syntagmatic and the paradigmatic dimension of regularity and association. It also has some context-dependent aspects to it that I didn't have the time to go into. Finally, I want to compare two adjectives, right and general, which at first glance look similar, except that the types of modifiers seem to be different. Let's have a closer look. The green parts here, the green portions, you can read those out, are words like Attorney General, Director General, the General Annual Meeting, General Election, General Practitioner. For all purposes, these combinations are what we can call compounds. They're very, very strongly associated syntagmatically, and they are very, very different semantically. So again, the syntagmatic dimension adds a lot to the meaning of this fairly general adjective, which is general. And what we can also see, of course, is that all these words have a strong pragmatic situational component and a social component. The general practitioner is a social phenomenon, so to speak, just like the general secretary in a very different field, the general manager, the general hospital, and so on. For right, the situation is partly similar, but also different. We also get a lot of social information. This is partly due to the special composition of the British National Corpus, which has a lot of text from politics. And so right and honorable, and gentleman are words that call up the context of parliamentary debates. But then again, we also have collocates which are very different in nature from what we got for general, but are, on the other hand, again, here to differentiate the meaning of right in different contexts. So the comparison is lots of resources for right, pragmatic, social, syntagmatic, and paradigmatic. The opposition to false and wrong and left is strong here, and also very strong pragmatic and social, as well as syntagmatic input into the meaning generation of general. Just two more examples where I haven't got data because they are so recent to illustrate extreme cases. This is an example from youth slang. The word sus, which is an abbreviation or a clipping, if you like, of the adjective suspicious, means more or less the same thing. There is not much, the meaning is similar. There is, of course, a meaning in sus, but it's beginning to get bleached because it is mainly associated with the types of persons who use this word. It is an identity marking element. So it has a lot of social meaning, a social indexicality, if you like, and it also has pragmatic meaning because it is used in informal and playful context, whereas the other types of resources, semiotic resources, are not very strong. And the same goes for my next example, which is POV, as used on social media, on TikTok and Insta, and you name it, which literally, of course, means point of view, but is used in very, very special ways on these platforms. There is some syntagmatic aspect to its semiotic foundations, but not a very strong one. Here too, it is very strongly, grounded in the pragmatic dimension associated with social media, and in the social dimension associated again with marking the identity of someone who is at home, metaphorically speaking, on social media platforms. Yet another intermediate summary. What I've tried to show is that different semiotic resources feed into the semantic profiles of words with different weights. You remember the different types of arrows, how thick and thin they were. Then words differ to some extent, at least systematically, with regard to the dominance of semiotic resources. This depends on word classes, on concreteness and animacy, perhaps on the semantic autonomy and specificity, and also on the polysemy. Take your mind back to the difference between smile and get, for example. Smile is semantically autonomous. It has a meaning of its own, much more than get has, but this weakness, if you like, of get, or the power, on the other hand, is compensated by its enormous versatility and the way it is then grounded in the syntagmatic association with words, and also its meaning is differentiated. The weight of the semiotic resources depends on the regularity in past usage history. That's where it all comes from, in the history of past usage events. What we also have to stress, and that's another aspect I will go into later on, is that all semiotic resources are probabilistic. It's never a dichotomy, yes or no. It's always different frequency distributions. There's more to come about this. Okay, I'm selling this as if it was totally new, and in a way it is. There are, of course, precursors everywhere around in the behavioral profile, a corner of cognitive semantics and in other fields. But what is easily overlooked is that this way of thinking about meaning actually ties in with familiar notions that everybody knows. So first of all, one thing that comes to mind is the notion of prototypes. What prototypes basically are is that in the system is that the meanings that are symbolically associated with lexemes, that is semasiologically, differ with regard to their strength of associations. And if we take a frequency-based account of meaning, we can see that using the data by Glynn that I mentioned earlier on. There's the usual frequency distribution of one meaning here standing out in frequency accounting for more than 30% of the uses, and then the typical Zipfian drop to less frequent and a big long tail of fairly rare meanings, so to speak. It's exactly the kind of regularity that I talked about on the symbolic dimension, and it's the probabilistic distribution that I also talked. Is all regular, but some things are more regular than others, if you like. And the meanings that stand out in frequency correspond to a frequency-based, I know that you can quarrel about that, to a frequency-based notion of prototype. Interestingly, what Glynn in his study also mentions is that there is a contextual dimension to it. Some of these meanings are more strongly associated with British English. What Glynn and Greece do not mention the way that I think they might have done is, in fact, that run, like get, also occurs in many, many combinations in particle verbs, run up, run over, and lots of things. So the syntagmatic dimension, of course, is also important here. It contributes also to the semiotic resources that create the prototypical meaning. The counterpart on the symbolic dimension is onomasiological symbolic regularity, and one concept that is familiar to everybody in this online room now is a basic level theory, or the Gerard's notion of onomasiological entrenchment. We know that if you have something in mind, as I suggested before, that some solutions are more frequent than others. So this is a search that I did in the British National Corpus 2014, which is a corpus that the colleagues from Lancaster University have also tagged semantically, using some kind of thesaurus, if you like. And you can search the corpus for meanings, and if you search the corpus for the communicative intention, I want to talk about moving, coming, and going. Perhaps not surprisingly, go is by far the most frequent verb. It would be something like a basic level verb, the go-to verb, so to speak, when you want to talk about going and moving, and then verbs like come and get and leave and walk and so on, which also come up if you search for this semantic tag, are again much less frequent. And the illustration goes on next to something everybody knows, the collocational differences with regard to attraction and the collostructural ones. So I've used the example of general here and looked at collocates in the slot immediately following general, which is R right in technical terms, so the word falling on the right-hand side. And in the British National Corpus, being such a politically biased corpus to some extent, at least general election, stands out by being most strongly attracted syntagmatically. Practitioner, secretary, and so on, gradually fading towards less frequent ones. And as you know, the same can be done for combinatorial patterns of lexicogrammatical constructions and the words that go into the variable slots. That is partly reported from a study that I should have mentioned here by myself and colleagues on the pattern that's right. And the striking thing again is that we have one adjective, which is right, standing out with a wide margin in frequency. That's a pattern that we find all over the place, and it means something that I will move on to in a second. Okay, so again, not everything that I'm saying here is new, but the integration of the dimensions of regularity and associations in one framework of meaning, I think, is. It's not the case that we look for meanings, and once we've done that, we look at contexts and registers and social variation, but it all goes into the machinery at the same time, because all these aspects of language use feed into meaning. This is reminiscent, as I said, of the technique of behavioral profiles by Gries and Glynn and Divjak and others, who use statistical techniques such as cluster analysis or correspondence analysis to show the generalizations that we can find. But the interaction between these semiotic resources can also be very, very specific, related to specific combinations, and that in a way is overlooked. It goes under the radar of the more generalization-seeking statistical techniques. Right, what is the potential contribution to long-standing issues? We are gradually moving towards the end of the talk. You will be relieved to hear that, but if you're given leeway to talk 60 to 90 minutes, maybe it's also good to exploit that. Now, what are potential? The first issue I want to talk about here is the long-standing problem of demarcating semantics and pragmatics, of demarcating listed meanings from meanings that are inferred or constructed in the context on the basis of context information. And that is also related to the question of how narrow, to what level of granularity we want to discriminate the senses of a polysemous lexeme. What is the boundary between context-dependent meaning and contextual meaning? So semantics in a narrow sense and pragmatics, pragmatic enrichment, contextual disambiguation on the other hand. For example, are the semantic variants of polysemous lexemes represented as distinct senses, or is there a general schematic representation which is disambiguated in context? One field where this discussion has been led in the literature quite hotly, so to speak, is how many senses does the word over have? Going back to Lakoff and Brugman, all the analysis, is every identifiable usage pattern that we can distinguish actually listed as a sense or stored in the mind of a speaker as a semantic unit, so to speak, or how many senses, as we just saw, does the verb to get have? What are just pragmatic nuances, and what are meanings associated, lexicalized to go along with that verb? I think the model I've presented has something to say about this, because it doesn't even raise the question. It doesn't raise the question because context and social information is always at work as a semiotic resource, and therefore the image I've shown of this trade-off between different dimensions of meanings gives an answer to that question. Let's not even start to demarcate, but let's give different weights to the different semiotic resources depending on the past history of that given convention. So we have a more dynamic and flexible interaction of the symbolic semiotic resource, which we traditionally consider to be the ultimate source of meaning, and all the other semiotic resources. Related to that is the fat note problem that Martin Hilpert pointed out in various publications, also in his 10 lectures on diachronic construction grammar. And the fat note problem is the following. Nodes in constructional networks are very heavy, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, because they have to carry a lot of semantic and functional information, especially the further down we get. If we have to put in all that pragmatic information as is demanded by many construction grammarians, then the meaning node, has to carry so much information that we can really call it fat. And is that a plausible way of thinking about how meaning is represented? To give an extreme example, if you put all the meanings that the Oxford English Dictionary lists for the verb get into the meaning and function slot of a construction, of a lexical construction represented here, the meaning, the form get, and all those meanings, that is indeed a very heavy node, and it would mean, going back to the semantics pragmatics demarcation, it would mean that it is a strongly semantically biased notion of the construction in this case. Again, I think we might have something to offer here, because the information about meaning in the case of the EC model resides in associations rather than nodes, and Martin Hilpert and Susanne Flach and others have started working out ways of showing how this might relieve some of the burden of the meaning nodes. How is that possible? It's because the symbolic associations are slim. They contain some core of the meaning, some sort of call it prototype, or maybe even better, schematic representation of the very general meaning, but all the fine semantic nuances, the details that go into the senses, they come up by the constellations, the competition and the cooperation of the different semiotic resources. So the symbolic associations need to carry much less weight, sorry, because semantic information also resides in the other semiotic resources. And as a final aspect, where I see a potential contribution, I would like to talk about semantic change very, very briefly, using a couple of examples. There's this recent semantic change that many people complain about of the little word literally, not only losing or bleaching its meaning, but taking up something like the opposite of it. So the literal use, it means truly, not figuratively, as in the example, he literally jumped into the air. But you find now expressions like I literally exploded, which cannot be read literally. So it cannot mean what it says. It is metaphorical. It's some sort of intensifier, or it even means figuratively, which would be the opposite of what literally, truly originally meant. But what has happened here, or what is happening as we are speaking, really, literally started out with a solid symbolic meaning and some effect of syntagmatic semiotic resources, how it was combined as an adverb preceding verbs. That has stayed the same, more or less, but we see a shift of dominance from the symbolic dimension to the pragmatic dimension. It's mainly used to get your argument across and to grab attention. It's an attention-getting device that has lost or reversed its meaning. Another example that we can observe very frequently is what I call syntagmatic strengthening, often accompanied by a pragmaticalization. We can observe that for the case of right in the collocation, that's right, and I'm not going to go into detail here to speed up a little. As we move from into the fixed expression, that's right, we see that again the pragmatic function, the pragmatic dimension as a semiotic resource is strengthened. The syntagmatic association between that's and right is strengthened, and these two processes lead to the fact that that's right today doesn't really mean that's right anymore, but is used by most people just to say, yeah, keep going, I'm listening, that's fine, don't worry, more or less. As we saw before, right stands out in the frequency distribution, and this is a very good prerequisite on the one hand for this process of syntagmatic and pragmatic strengthening, chunking to take place. It is at the same time an effect of that process. So again, we have our feedback loop system where things that are gradually glued together, so to speak, by a repeated co-occurrence, take on a different meaning and function, and then become even more frequent and are glued together even more as this process, this feedback process continues. I've looked at other patterns, like the pattern at the word plus of the word, where we also have something standing out here in frequency. This is at the end of the day, which, as you probably know, is used idiomatically to mean if all things are considered. We find something similar for the fixed expression on the other hand, which also stands out in frequency compared to all other instantiations of the same pattern if we search it in a wildcard way. So there is a tendency for the most dominant items with regard to regularity to start a life of their own. The final example here is at the same time, which is very extreme in its frequency difference to at the other end, the runner-up in terms of frequency of the pattern at the adjective noun. Right. We are through. I've raised the questions, what is meaning? where is meaning and how does meaning change. I'm not going to offer a big conclusion because then I would have to repeat everything, and you are clearly impatient now. I will stop at this point, and I would like to thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to some questions if you're willing to ask them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schmid, for the enlightening talk. And please have a rest, take some water. Before moving on to the question and answer session, I hope that you wouldn't mind that I take a rather brief summary of what you've told us. Along these three questions that Professor Schmid has brought at the very beginning of this talk, I guess we've already got a very clear answer that what is meaning? It is dynamic network of probabilistic associations like across multiple dimensions where we've got the symbolic ones, syntagmatic ones, paradigmatic ones, as well as the pragmatic and social ones. Thus, meaning is ever-changing and emerging instead of a static, rightified entity that's stored somewhere. And where is meaning? It is actually distributed across our mental lexicon of individuals as well as the community, as reviewed in the usage patterns. And how the meaning changes, it is changed through the continuous process of entrenchment and conventionalization, as captured by the tingling-like machine proposed by Professor Schmid. And I will not take up too much time, and I'd like to give more time for the speakers to raise their questions, or you can just go into direct interaction with Professor Schmid if possible. Like any speaker can turn on the video and a microphone to ask questions. Hi, Thomas.
Yeah,
would you like
I
to
take the chance to report the size of the audience, and we have another room organized by the Chinese software, the Tencent. Now we have 130 participants, and in this have close to 85. So altogether, you have attracted 200 plus audience for tonight.
Oh, thank you. That's very impressive. So
that is the latest usage-based model of meaning. Is that correct?
I didn't get one bit. You were frozen for a very short time for me. Could you repeat your question, please?
Yeah, is your model can be called the usage-based model of meaning?
Yes, absolutely. I would say it is, as some people have called it, a radically usage-based model of meaning. But it doesn't, like the meaning is use model, put all the meaning into use only. It tries to explain how usage and the community and the mind work together in this process, in this complex process to create the meaning. But it's definitely usage-based, very strongly.
Yeah, and your model is based on a large data, empirical data, so you leave no room for further empirical test. Do you leave any room for empirically test your model or empirically against your model in? Yeah, and could you talk about something like this? How to support your model empirically
Yes, yes. Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, So far, I've supported the model with some exemplary case studies using corpus data. That's, of course, that only goes to a certain point. What we need will be much more complex models, also more statistical models, as many people have suggested many colleagues in linguistics. Now, I'm a bit torn between two options here. One option is, for example, what Stefan Gries and others have done in their behavioral profile analysis. It is the quest for identifying generalizations. And that's what these powerful statistical models are good for. We see strong patterns in the data, and we see the effect of certain factors on the overall distribution, and can derive predictions from that. This should be complemented, I think, however, by a very close look at local effects, as I mentioned. As I said, for example, some of these particle verbs or phrasal verbs behave in a way which is very, very different from the overall picture, and that is, as far as as I've learned, is a bit more difficult to describe by means of, say, correspondence analysis or cluster analysis, because that's the broader picture. What we eventually need, I think, is techniques, a combination of techniques that combine the different perspectives. Maybe even large language models will help us to make progress there. So I'm looking forward to smart people in the audience and elsewhere who come up with with better ways of combining. We need both of combining the search for generalizations and a good eye for local effects.
Okay, thank you. Now we do have some questions from the other room. Hello, Zifan. I don't know whether Professor can see the question.
Yeah, Professor, here are some questions raised by our audience from the other platform. The first one is about how could this model shed light on second language acquisition?
That's a very interesting question. It can shed light on second language acquisition in various ways. We have to be very precise about what we are talking about, however, and what kind of second language acquisition. Is it a classroom instruction context, or is it an immersion learning context? Because the processes that are involved in second language learning will be very different. If you have a learner that gets a lot of input in an immersion situation, living in an environment where the language is spoken and they can participate in discourse, then I think the model would make predictions that are very clear. The more input you get, the more you refine your records of regularities on all levels of language, the more you will advance in your proficiency in the language. So the implicit learning mechanism that lies at the heart of the EC model can be applied. If, on the other hand, you have a classroom situation where speakers don't get enough input, but are mainly taught to improve their explicit learning strategies, then the model is less applicable, I would say, because the basic mechanisms only apply indirectly or not at all, simply because the machine cannot do its work. There's not enough usage for entrenchment to reflect the general regularity in the speech community.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And we've got a second question, which is about the automaciological uses of the motion and movement verbs. He asks, why is the frequency of go is the highest for moving? It is even like 3 times more than that of calm.
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, it is a good question. It's semantically, of the verbs that we saw, it's semantically the most general one, or the one that has acquired the most general meaning. I don't think that the going to future goes into that. That's a matter of how well the corpus has been tagged, which would increase that number even more, but in a way which is not appropriate, I would think. In a way, go is the general purpose human locomotion verb, and that's why it is also not directional as opposed to come or leave. So it's semantically less specific and therefore more widely applicable to a larger number of situations. That is, I think, the main reason. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there to leave more room for further questions.
All right. Let's move to the next one. The next question is about like the interplay or the relative importance of conventionalization and entrenchment. She asks if the emergence of a construction, as far as emergence of construction is concerned, is it first entrenched in the individual speaker's mind and then becomes conventionalized in the community level, or it is just the other way around?
Mm-hmm. That's a very intriguing question. I've filled a number of pages in my book to discuss it, so maybe you might we want to have a look at that, because it depends on so many factors. It depends on the type of construction you're talking about. Is it like a lexical-grammatical pattern, or is it a new word that will be different from changes of long time grammatical rules, so to speak, at the heart of grammar? Generally speaking, I think all avenues are theoretically possible. But it's in an actual fact, because we were talking about empirical aspects, in actual fact, it can often be very difficult to distinguish between them. Now, I have looked at cases where one piece of evidence, for example, is the distribution that you find in your data. If you have something that is distributed very unevenly, so you have a small number of speakers or writers who use a certain pattern, but these use it in high frequency and in high systematicity, you can say that only a small portion of the speech community at that stage has a strongly entrenched representation, and that then usualization and diffusion can gradually contribute to the conventionalization. If, on the other hand, you have something that is distributed evenly across a certain part of a larger speech community, but the users don't use it a lot at that stage, but are sort of in tune with their frequency increases, then I would say usualization is the stronger factor, and entrenchment is an effect of the increase in usualization. But that is highly theoretical and would have to be checked empirically with different kinds of constructions and words and expressions.
Thank you for your answer. And we've got another question that is about the potential gradient relation connecting different constructions. William Chen mentioned that in your 2020 book, you've claimed that schemas not in categorical terms, focusing on the question of which schemas exist and which ones do not, but in gradient terms. Like, so in the network of linguistic knowledge or the constructional network, is it possible that these different constructions are also connected through gradient relations?
Yes. Yeah, interesting question. I can simply say yes. I would certainly say there's gradient connections depending on the same factors, really. It's a matter of the variability in the input? Well, what is the extent of the commonality like that I can use to routinize a certain pattern? And that then will also relate to the question how frequent it is and all that, how much different constructions then go into competition in the network, and that is definitely gradient. There might be a point also if constructions develop and emancipate, so to speak, as in the case of, on the other hand, for example, that this specific construction moves away from the general schematic pattern and acquires a place in this constructional or associative network that is new, but it will still be, it will take a long time until we have a very, I don't know, a clear-cut separation.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And we've got another question from Edmund Kane. He asks regarding the various senses of constructions like over, get. Do you think we can consider the context-independent content as already crystallized nodes, while the context-dependent fragments as crystallization on their way? Then does it lead to considering constructionally established subnodes within constructions? And eventually, even at this level, it implies usage-based mechanisms in the content making involving usage events, context, or frames, abstract content at varying levels, as well as remaining exemplars.
Oh, that's a mouthful. I don't think I could follow everything.
Actually, the questions are typed in the chat box.
Yes, I can have a look at it if you don't mind me taking the time. Yeah, I'll stay with the first question. Can we consider the context-independent content as already crystallized nodes? Well, yes, I think we can say that to some extent, as some of the examples have shown. Once the symbolic association takes over a key role as a semiotic resource, from a traditional perspective, we would say, yes, it has been semanticized. This has gone into the stable meaning component, has crystallized, as was said here. The question is whether all context-dependent fragments will eventually become crystallized. I don't think that happens, but there are some that can. We have changes of the semantic change of the type amelioration, or also if the meaning gets word pejoration. That would be the type of process where what was originally contextual meaning then finds its way into symbolic meaning. Yes, but it can be reverted, as we know from the examples in the literature. There's no one-way street, I would say. It's not a tilled process that it always must lead to something becoming symbolized, so to speak, semanticized.
Well, thank you. And here are another two questions. One is about how can we use easy model to solve lexical problem beyond the constructional ones?
Lexical problem, not really be repaired by Anna. I would need to know what the lexical problem is, I'm afraid. I don't understand that question. To solve it's not restricted to constructions. It's certainly applicable to words. The words are the key components of the model. So that would have to be looked into what is meant by the lexical problem.
Yeah. And or else we can just move on to the next question. It is about like how to use this model to explain the usage of shell nouns in language. And also the audience is rather curious about the role of frequency criteria as a basis of this model.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, shell nouns, that's an way back. Shell nouns can be explained quite well with this idea of meaning, because it is part of the nature of shell nouns that they are semantically fairly open. They have some sort of semantic core, which we can say is the symbolic semiotic resource, but then all of it, so to speak, depends on what they are combined with. So shell nouns, for those who don't know them, will be words like fact or idea or problem that tend to be combined with longer propositional content to be filled in expressions like the idea was to go out and have a party, or the problem was that I hadn't brought any money, stuff like that. So it's like, in a way, it's like get. Shell nouns have a fairly narrow symbolic semiotic resource, but rely on syntagmatic combinations. They also are used, many of them are used with specific communicative function, often getting an argument across. So they also have a strong contextual foundation. I would think I could have chosen them. They are a nice example to illustrate this trade-off of different dimensions. They're also in paradigmatic competition with each other. That's also something that plays a role. Now, frequency as the basis of the model is very simplistic. That was the second part of the question. It's very simplistic because, again, frequency does not have just one type of effect, and it is modulated by so many other factors. In the larger book, I wrote a lot about the forces that affect how this machine can do its work and how frequency affects it. So we have to be very careful that we don't mix up different types of frequencies, and we have to be very careful that we keep in mind the effects of all the other dimensions of regularity when counting frequencies. That's part of the problem. If that were easy, it would be easy to apply the model. But since there's so much complexity in it, like in a complex adaptive system, the empirical part becomes much more demanding.
And actually, personally, I have got another two questions. One is about the corpus data. There is a highly debated cognition to corpus or corpus to cognition mapping debate.
Mm-hmm.
So personally, I'm really interested in taking this perspective of entrenchment and conventionalization model, like how you're going to get engaged in this kind of debate. For example, can we say that corpus data stands for the degree of conventionalization? But if we take a more individual specific data into consideration, that might shed some light on the degree of entrenchment instead.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, I would certainly support that idea. I think one should add perhaps what the logic about the second approach is. So if you have a representative, the first approach, corpus as input, as it has been called, and corpus as representing conventionality, that's fairly obvious. If you have a representative, whatever that is, corpus, it is a picture, a snapshot of the conventions at that time. Now, the other approach is a bit more complicated. If we take the contributions to the corpora by individuals as a window to entrenchment, then there's one important step in the logic, and that's the logic of competitive routinization and competitive activation. Because the logic is, if some person who contributed to the corpus used one way of solving a communicative task, more frequently than another way in a given context, in a given social situation. All that has to be factored in. Then, given the logic of entrenchment, what is more entrenched is more likely to be activated. We can argue that the more entrenched options have made it to the surface and therefore into the corpus. That, I think, should always be spelled out as being the conceptual foundation underlying this kind of use of corpora.
I know that. Thank you. And actually, I have another question concerning the symbolic association. Like in your engagement with the fact node problem, you mentioned that the symbolic association is is kind of ever the slimmest one. And throughout the examples, which is about language change, we can also find that it is always the symbolic association like shrinks in terms of its weight, thus giving its place to pragmatic ones or the sociocultural ones. So does that mean iconicity is not that important in shaping the language change in terms of the long time development?
What was that iconicity you said?
Yep.
Yes. Well, I don't know how important it is for shaping long-term change. It might be the case that way back iconicity is one of the motivations for the symbolic association with which something started out 10 years ago or 10,000 years ago. And that might have, you might have changed not only the processes you mentioned, syntagmaticalization, pragmaticalization, but also processes on the formal side, like reduction and others, that somehow mask the original iconicity. I have to admit, I'm definitely not an expert in that, but whereas they start out having an iconic motivation, as we all know, can lose it and look as if they were totally arbitrary lexemes. And there are so many different processes that can lead to that it's difficult to generalize. But I think you have another question about that. You look like that.
Yeah, because I've noted that in your book you've like made a kind of corollary that iconicity is conducive to grammar, since what is get entrenched and conventionalized is more iconic. Then I was like kind of surprised to see that it is always the symbolic association that is shrinking.
Yes, yeah. That's a very interesting observation. And the only way, or what comes to mind is the fact that once you use something that has an iconic motivation in repeated syntagmatic context, which is inevitable, and repeated situational context, it gets under fire, so to speak, from these dimensions, and then these changes happen.
Yeah, I got that. Thank you. Well, actually, we have got another question here that is about the weight of associations. Where Sarah mentions that according to the easy model, pragmatic, syntagmatic, paradigmatic, and social associations all contribute to the meanings of an item, but the weight of these associations differs for a specific item, which results in the differences for the meaning profiles. It works quite well actually for lexical item, but does it work similarly for a larger linguistic unit, say a construction, or even a discourse?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Definitely, it also works for larger units that carry meaning, so constructions or even pieces of discourse or whole chunks of discourse. One example I can think of is perhaps if you're telling a joke, then at the beginning, so to speak, unless you have a clear marker of the start of the joke, it might be taken for some normal story that you're telling that doesn't have a punchline at the end and is intended to be humorous. So it starts more as getting across meaning in a literal sense, as on the semantic dimension. But at the point where people realize that this is a joke or this is intended ironically, perhaps, there's a sudden shift towards the contextual and the social dimension, because joke telling is a very important social activity, and in that sense, even a large chunk of discourse can shift its meaning, so to speak, from moment to moment.
Thank you for your answer. And I guess we're almost done with today's talk, with so many insights we've already accumulated from this lecture and this Q&A session. So Thomas, would you like have anything else to add or comment before we?
I might ask a question for the audience as
Yeah.
a take-home message. Could you, based on your model of meaning, could you provide a concise definition for your view of language? Just like, for Chomsky, language is innate. For Langecker, meaning is conceptualization, or language is. So for you, what is language?
Well, that's a tricky question. If you want a one-sentence answer,
Yeah.
I would be in strong opposition to Chomsky. I would say language is a way of communicating ideas and identities.
Language, Zifan, could you repeat? Language is communication
communicating ideas and identities.
Identities. So to me, as opposed to Chomsky, the pragmatic and the social aspects would be at the center of what language is all about.
So I guess the co-semiosis notion is quite incisive in this way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And is that written in your big book, 2020 book?
Yeah,
The concise definition.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a big, long definition about what language is. It's more complex, but it boils down to these aspects. Yes. Somewhere towards the end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope the audience can take home the last sentence.
Well, so thank you for your commitment to this lecture. And let's call it a day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for handling this in such an elegant way. It was a pleasure being with you. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Bye. Have a nice day. And Beihang, could you please send the posters to the group or the chat box?
好的，我现在发一下。
Yeah, dear audience, here we are going to add another 2 posters, which promotes another 2 upcoming lectures next week. Please feel free to join us if you're interested in our topics. All right. Yeah, that's the end of today's talk. Thank you for joining us. See you next time. Bye.
拜拜，谢谢大家。
再见。那我也退出这个。